All right, another major category of the DSM-5 is going to be the category of mood disorders. So looking at mood disorders, they are generally defined as disorders characterized by emotional extremes. So there are a lot of disorders listed underneath this category, but the two major ones that we're going to be focusing on are going to be the category of depressive disorders and then the category of bipolar and related disorders. And in this lesson, we're going to focus mainly on depressive disorders. So looking at how the DSM-5 treats depressive disorders, we can see that there are a couple of changes with how the DSM-5 is going to approach depressive disorders. I know my webcam is cutting off some of that, so I'll move in a second. But let's take the first bullet point. With the DSM-5, we have the introduction of a couple of new disorders. We have something called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. We have premenstrual dysphoric disorder. We see the introduction of these disorders moving from the appendix of the DSM-4 TR now to the main body of the DSM-5. We also see the introduction of disruptive mood dysregulation disorder just to cut down the potential overdiagnosis of more of different disorders in youth. There is a lot of concern that what is maybe normal behavior is being turned into something clinical when you're dealing with children. So they wanted to introduce a disorder which allowed for the exhibition of symptoms in children. And then lastly, and let me move right now. We see a change in how chronic depression is treated. In the DSM-4 TR, there was a diagnosis of something known as dysthymia. That has been moved out, and that now falls under the category of what we call persistent depressive disorder, which is also a category that includes chronic major depressive disorder. So a couple of changes, but what we want to make clear is that in terms of the DSM-5 versus the DSM-4, major depressive disorder and what the symptoms are really haven't changed in the DSM-5. There was a decently controversial adjustment made to MDD for the DSM-5, not in terms of the symptoms, but there used to be what we would call a bereavement exclusion in the DSM-4, where if you had just suffered a loss about 2 months ago, then you wouldn't be diagnosed as having major depressive disorder, and that's been removed. And the reason for that is, one, in the DSM-5, they didn't want to suggest that there's a normal grieving period of 2 months, that if you are grieving more than 2 months, that means that there's something wrong with you. So they thought that to put a time limit on grief was inaccurate. And then secondly, they wanted to acknowledge that sometimes psychological disorders, a depressive episode, can be triggered by loss. And to have the bereavement exclusion might have ignored some of that. It was controversial, though, because people say that grief is a normal human response and that they're worried that this might pathologize some of that. But how is major depressive disorder diagnosed? Well, I'm just going to run you through a couple of the symptoms. You can certainly look up the rest of them if you want to Google DSM-5 major depressive disorder. But generally, a person will experience, and it's important to note that this is in the absence of any sort of medication or some other underlying medical condition, 2 or more weeks of significantly depressed mood. So we have an emotional component, feelings of worthlessness. They experience what we would call anhedonia. That term you may or may not be familiar with. The prefix "an" means absence of. Hedonia relates to like someone who, like, think of the word hedonistic or hedonism, meaning pleasure seeking. So to feel anhedonia means you feel an absence of pleasure. Someone who's experiencing major depressive disorder often finds it impossible to really enjoy anything. They engage in conversations, they go and do things socially, and it just doesn't feel anything to them. You sort of almost feel numb. That's what anhedonia is getting at, that doing normal everyday activities that for most people would be enjoyable is not enjoyable for you. You just feel an absence of pleasure. Now, at least 5 signs of depression need to be present for 2 or more weeks to be diagnosed as having major depressive disorder. And so I've just given you a couple of the symptoms. There's a whole laundry list of them, but I just wanted to give you some of like the key ones. And then I also wanted to really emphasize that depression is not just emotional. And I think that as a society, we're starting to get that. You even see some of the commercials that have been popular lately talking about treatment for depression. They really will focus on the idea that like depression hurts. And they don't just mean like it hurts your heart or it hurts your mood. That's certainly the case. There's a really big mood emotion component, but depression physically hurts. You feel this anguish of grief, but it's combined with what we might call the sluggishness of jet lag. Your whole body can feel just weighted down. It's really difficult to get out of bed in the mornings. You feel like it takes more effort for you to go through your daily activities, even just walking and moving around. It really saps you of your energy. You feel lethargic. You feel like you're moving through molasses. And so it's important to note that depression is not just something that you experience emotionally, it's something that you can experience physiologically. And I'm going to link you in the comments to a case study where you can see some of these symptoms playing out. Now, my assumption is that you've heard about depression before, mainly because it is the number one reason that people seek mental health services, especially in the United States. Depression is very, very, very common. There's a statistic that almost 15% of United States adults will suffer at some point with depression in their lives. So that's a really large incidence rate. According to the World Health Organization, sorry, I just had to move the screen again. It is the leading cause of disability. So leading cause of people needing to take time out of work and put in for disability leave because they're suffering from a depressive episode. And then if we look at a gender breakdown, depression is more common in women as opposed to men. Both mood and anxiety disorders tend to impact women a little bit more than men. So about 6% of men and about 10% of women will experience some sort of depressive episode per year. Now, when we look at the people who are diagnosed with depression, about 25% of individuals who receive a depressive episode diagnosis are struggling with some sort of significant loss. And so there is the suggestion, or not even the suggestion, there's a hypothesis that depression has emerged based on the evolutionary perspective as a way to serve a protective function. When you are depressed, what happens is you start to slow down. You don't tend to engage in risk-taking behavior. You tend to keep to yourself. And so by doing that, you're not exposing yourself to harm and you're not exposing yourself to risks. Another maybe silver lining of depression, if we want to say that, and I don't want to negate the harmful influence of depression. It's a very serious diagnosis and depression itself is not a good thing. But if we want to take the evolutionary perspective, we want to ask ourselves, why is it so common? How has it sort of stayed around in the gene pool for so long? When people are experiencing a depressive episode, they sometimes, after coming out of that depressive episode, say that it allowed them to realign their priorities, maybe change their direction in life more for the positive. But this is just maybe like a potential silver lining, and I'm even uncomfortable saying that. I'm just sort of running you through the potential reasons why depression is so common. There might be, from an evolutionary perspective, a reason why it is in our genetic code, and that's one of them. And then lastly, I wanted to run you through a couple of other symptoms of depression. I gave you the really big ones at the start of this lesson, but there are more of them, and so I wanted to make a couple of notes. One, somewhat strangely, depression is oftentimes associated with insomnia. And I say strangely because depression makes us think of someone who's like really lethargic and lacking energy, and they struggle sometimes to just get out of bed. But that doesn't mean that they're sleeping all the time. Sleep loss is associated with anxiety and mood disorders. And so insomnia can kind of cycle with depression and can trigger depressive episodes and can make depressive episodes seem worse. Depression is also oftentimes associated with just a feeling of apathy. And this is probably tied up in the anhedonia, but just a lack of caring about anything. This feeling of numbness and being almost removed and distant from the world that plays out in a loss of interest in family and friends and activities. It's difficult to work up the energy to want to engage with any of these people or with any of these things because you don't care anymore. It doesn't bring you any sort of pleasure and it's just easier to not engage. And then lastly, depressive symptoms are often amplified by alcohol. We know that alcohol is a depressant physiologically, and so it's a dangerous combination to mix alcohol with depression. And so I always tell you guys that it's really important to know your family history. It's important to know your family history of, our traditional medical conditions, heart disease, cancer, but it's also important to know psychologically where your family stands. Do you have a history of addiction? Do you have a history of alcoholism? Do you have a history of depressive disorders? Knowing that can arm you with the knowledge that you need to make the right choices for yourself in life as you approach the future.